All right. Welcome to day 3 of the AP World History Modern review sessions here on YouTube. It's good to be back. If you weren't here on Wednesday, my name is Mason Logereau. I teach in the Austin, Texas area at Pflugerville High School in Pflugerville, Texas. And I'm excited to be here. It's Friday, so yay. Although, let's be honest, with quarantine going on, every day feels the same, doesn't it? But that's okay. We're going to have a good time today. So let's talk about what we're going to do today. All right. So the last 2 days, Wednesday with me, yesterday with Mr. Smith, we've been talking about the Cold War. Today, I'm going to look at communism specifically and how it spread outside the Soviet Union after World War II. So we're going to take a long look at China, and then we're also going to talk a little bit about Latin America as well. I also want to talk some more about primary source documents because on Wednesday when we talked a little bit about point of view, purpose, situation, audience, that sourcing of the documents. Today I want to talk about limitations. And if you noticed here at the top, when I put limitations of documents, I put in big capital letters, not bias. And I'm going to talk about the difference between limitations of a document and the bias of a document and why we really need to focus on limitations. All right. So for our warm up, yesterday, Mr. Smith gave y'all some homework, and I put homework in quotes because neither he nor I are your teacher, but a nice activity you could do to do a little review for the AP test. And he did a really great job of talking about how to make historical comparisons, how to look at similarities and differences. And he talked about Beyonce and, oh, crud. What was the name of the band that he mentioned yesterday? I cannot remember. He's a lot more hip to music than I am. That is just sadly not my thing. But anyway, he did a really good job with it. So if you didn't watch yesterday's lesson, make sure you go back and do that. But the questions he left for y'all, we're looking at similarities and differences in ways that the United States and the Soviet Union tried to maintain control of their allies during the Cold War. So letters A and B were basically the same question. Identify one thing, identify another example. So under letter B, here are a couple of examples of similarities in the way the United States and the Soviet Union sought to maintain control. So a couple of them here. First, establishing defensive alliances. We talked on Wednesday, and he talked about yesterday, that need for military allies. Both the United States and the Soviets were fighting for those. Nuclear proliferation. He did a great job of talking about the buildup of nuclear weapons as a deterrent against nuclear war. They both engaged in those proxy wars. He mentioned Korea, he mentioned Vietnam. Those are both perfect examples of proxy wars. And then also dependent relationships with other states. So handing out aid like the Marshall Plan to gather economic allies that would be supportive of the United States and the Soviet Union. And then the last question was, what's a difference between the ways the Soviet Union and the United States maintain control? One major difference you got to think about is that for the Soviet Union, especially in Eastern Europe, we know that they controlled those puppet regimes of Eastern Europe, that the Soviets were in control of those governments, even if they looked like they were independent nations. And so the Soviets were kind of obvious about their use of force. The United States, however, was a lot more covert. In fact, I'm going to give you a perfect example of that at the end of today's lesson, but we'll get there in a little bit. All right, so what do you need to know about today? Like I said, I want to talk about the Chinese Communist Revolution, but before we can do that, we need to talk about the major players. There are two people that you need to know when talking about the Chinese Revolution. The first is Chiang Kai-shek. Okay, let's do a real quick brief of all of Chinese history, which there's a lot of that, by the way, as you've learned this year. We know that the dynastic system of China that had been there since, BCE times had ended by the early 20th century. Remember, China underwent some major problems in the 1800s, the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, of course, lost to the Opium Wars. And so by the early 1900s, there were no more Chinese dynasties. Instead, you could have a series of nationalistic leaders ruling China. And Chiang Kai-shek was the one in the 1920s. You also have Mao Zedong. Now, Mao should be a name that you could kind of recognize or sort of recognize, even if you haven't looked at the Chinese Communist Revolution before. Mao grew up in southern China. His father was a pretty well-to-do farmer, not like super rich or anything, but definitely not peasant. And as Mao went through school, he started to read some of the classics of communist literature, and he himself sort of began to adopt communist philosophy. And then as he got a little older, he started preaching that philosophy to peasant farmers in his region of South China. Now, one of the big things that he always focused on was the idea of land distribution. Because remember, we're talking about peasant farmers who are resentful of very wealthy landowners in the area. That's something we've kind of seen throughout Chinese history. And now here's Mao promising to take land from the wealthy and put it under control of all the people. So you can imagine he's starting to gain a lot of popularity. All right, long story short, I wish we could get more into the revolution itself because it is a very interesting story. And as I've said already, I'm hitting the high points of what we're doing here. If you want more information, please, please, please talk to your teacher. They want to hear from you, or consult your textbook. But I wish we could talk about Mao's Long March and all of that, but we just simply don't have time. But long story short, for about the next 19 years, Mao put together an army, a communist army, and fought Chiang's nationalist army. It was an extremely bloody civil war that lasted until 1949. Now, you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, Logero. Didn't Japan invade China during World War II and occupied large parts of China? Yes, very smart student. You are exactly correct. So during that time of Japanese occupation, you actually do see a pause in the Civil War. Both the nationalists and the communists were fighting against the Japanese. And actually, that Japanese occupation gave the communists time to sort of regroup because they were losing the war pretty badly. But I'll talk about that later on, how the Japanese invasion actually gave a boost to the communist army. All right, so to end the whole thing, spoiler alert, Mao's communist army wins the revolution. Now, that happens in 1949. If you remember on Wednesday, we talked about the idea of containment for the United States, that they were going to contain communism to the Soviet Union. And that was announced by Harry Truman right before 1949. So you can imagine the situation for the United States when they gave a lot of help and aid to Chiang's nationalist forces. And now one of the largest, most populous countries in Asia has fallen to communism as soon as the idea of containment was announced. This was a huge blow to American foreign policy. All right, let's pause on the story for a little bit and talk a little bit about skills that you're going to need for the AP test that's coming up next month, or sorry, in May. And also for those of you that are going to be taking AP US history and AP European history in the coming years, you're going to need to focus on these same skills. Okay, so like I said, last time we talked about point of view, purpose, situation, audience, and we talked about how to identify it and also use it to make a historical claim. Today, I want to think about limitations of a document. But what I don't want to talk about is bias. Because I see this word bias a lot in my students' work at Pflugerville and when I grade for the actual AP test. Because yes, I'm one of the graders for the AP test. I've done it for the last several years. And if you don't know how this works, the first week of June, several hundred teachers from around the country get together, and for 8 days straight, they do nothing but grade the essays on the AP test. I know it sounds like a blast. Actually, it is. I actually kind of enjoy it. Don't tell anybody. It's kind of weird on me. But I see this word bias happening, seeing it a lot of times in student work. But here's what we need to consider, is that there's always going to be some level of bias in every document. Instead, I want to sort of look past that, and I want to think about limitations. Okay, let me give you an example. I told y'all I grew up in South Louisiana. I am a huge, huge fan of LSU. In fact, I even got my shirt today. Go Tigers. So when it comes to college football, I'm a huge LSU fan. I grew up going to all the games with my dad. I love the Tigers. If you ask me at the beginning of each year, hey, how's LSU going to do this year? Every single year, I'm going to tell you at the beginning of the year, oh, they're going to do great. They're going to beat Alabama this year. They're going to win the SEC, make the playoff, and who knows? They might be national champions. Okay, most years, I am wrong. True. Except for this year, because by the way, they did win the national championship. So go Tigers. My apologies to any of you students that are in Alabama or Georgia or South Carolina that are Clemson fans. Sorry if I'm bringing up a sore subject. But this year I was right. So notice something. Even though a document might be biased, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. It still can be correct. I am biased towards LSU, but I was right this year. Instead, though, think about the idea of limitations. Okay, if you ask me my opinion on college football, I can give you some opinions. I watch a lot of football. I read a lot about it. I know a fair amount, but there are limitations to my knowledge. I'm not a coach. I'm not a player. I don't go to practices. I don't know what the game plan is for each week. I don't personally know any of the coaches or players. There's people with a lot more knowledge of college football than me. So I have limitations there. But if you use me as a source, I may not be able to tell you everything about the team and all the strategies, but I can give you information about how the average fan feels. So notice, even when there's bias or limitations in a document, there are still ideas that you can glean from those documents. And as historians, that's what you have to be able to do. You have to look past the bias. I'm not saying to get rid of it completely. You still need to make sure you understand it, but you really want to focus on limitations. And then you take a bunch of sources, you put them together to come up with a coherent historical argument. I'll give you another historical example. When I was in college, one of the longest papers I had to write was on the role of the Catholic Church in World War II in fighting Nazis and trying to stop the Holocaust. And so, as the young historian that I was, I got together a bunch of primary sources, and I had some sources from Catholic sides that said the Pope did everything he could to try and stop the Holocaust. And then I had documents from anti-Catholic positions saying, man, the Pope was basically on Hitler's side. Now, those are two extremes of the question. Neither of them is really correct. The answer is somewhere in the middle. So again, your job is to not think about the bias, but think about the limitations and think about the truths that you can find in those documents and put them all together. So let's do some examples. I'm going to give you one example, and then I'm going to set you free to do a couple on your own. All right, so this is from an older DBQ from an AP test from a couple years ago. Notice the prompt here. We're going to analyze the relationship between Chinese peasants and the Chinese Communist Party. And this first document is from Mao Zedong himself. So what I'd like for you to do is to read this document. I'm going to give you about 1 minute to do it. And then I'm going to talk about the historical situation and purpose and also the limitations. Okay, ready? You got 1 minute to read it, starting now. All right, about 30 seconds. Like I said, keep reading and also kind of think in your head about historical situation and purpose. And then I'll talk about limitations. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so historical situation. Here we have Mao writing right before this major revolution. Notice the date on here is 1927. So right before the revolution starts. This is Mao's attempt at pumping up the farmers in his area. Okay, this is me pre-football season going, yeah, things are going to be great. He's just trying to pump everybody up, get everybody on his side. Now, is this document biased? Of course it is. But we're not going to think about that. We're going to think about the limitations. Okay? Yes, there are limitations. We are getting one story from the leader of the Communist Party. But there are still things that we can tell from this document. For example, we can think about the main goals that Mao and the communists are trying to reach. Look at this last sentence. We're going to sweep all the imperialists, warlords, corrupt officials, local tyrants, and evil landowners into their graves. These were the goals of the Communist Party. So we already have the listing of goals from this document. So yes, there's bias, yes, there's limitations, but we still can see some historical ideas there. All right, so I'm going to give you all this one. This is going to be on your own this time. This is the same prompt. It's a different document. This time I want you to read the document, and I want you to identify a historical situation or purpose, and then I want you to identify limitations of the source. And I'm going to give you about 4 minutes or so to do that. So ready, go. All right, you got about 2 more minutes. Make sure you're writing down historical situation or purpose, and also make sure you're writing down some limitations of this document. All right, 1 more minute. All right, so let's talk about this document here. We've got a communist report from the Chinese party about what Japan is doing in these villages with very exact numbers of the number of people killed, the farm animals that are killed, um, money that's stolen, all that sort of thing. So if we think about a historical situation, like we were talking about earlier, we know that Japan was occupying several large parts of China during World War II. And we also know that the Chinese Communist Party was attempting to fight this Japan occupation. Now, if we think about limitations, is it possible that these numbers are exaggerated? Yes, that is definitely a possibility. I mean, you also got to consider maybe they were exaggerated on purpose, or during wartime, things are always extremely chaotic. It's really hard to get exact numbers of casualties and animals destroyed and things like that. So I can't tell you for sure if these numbers are accurate. We would need another source to help confirm that. But here's something that we can tell. Even with those limitations, if we're not exactly sure of the numbers, we can tell from this document that the Communist Party is fighting the Japanese and fighting the Japanese occupation. And by the way, remember what I said a second ago? The Japanese occupation actually helped the Communist Party kind of rearm, resupply, regather their forces together. And at the end of World War II, when Japan was finally defeated and left China, a lot of people across China saw the Communist Party as the ones that were fighting and defeated the Japanese, not Chiang Kai shek's Nationalist Party. So the Communist Party got a lot of support from the people across China because they were seen as the ones that defeated the Japanese. So again, even with the limitations of this document, we can still find and still use and make an historical argument with this document. All right, let's do one more here. This is the same prompt. Same thing as before. I'm going to give you about 4 minutes. I want you to think specifically about the purpose and also pay special attention to who is writing this. And then I want you to jot down the purpose and possible limitations of this source. And I'm going to give you 4 minutes to do that. Ready? Go. All right, take about 2 more minutes. Again, make sure you've identified the purpose, then also make sure you understand some limitations of the source. All right, one more minute. Make sure you got some ideas just jotted down on some paper. All right. So here we have an American journalist who's telling a story of a conversation that he heard between a teenager and his grandfather. All right. So the purpose is here we have an American journalist who's trying to tell the story of the Chinese Revolution to people in the United States. So when you think about this, this is just a story of a conversation he heard. This is like one of those man on the street interviews that you see on the news. Now, anytime you see something like that, you have to ask yourself, wait a minute, this one person is saying this, and okay, they believe it. But does that mean that everybody in China thought this? Or that all teenagers in China thought this? And the answer is, of course, no, not every teenager. But if we think about the fact that this reporter heard this story, he probably heard it multiple times in multiple different ways. So we can get the idea that a lot of young people in China felt this way, and that there definitely was a generational divide. So the limitation is, okay, we don't know if every teenager thought this. We also don't know if Mao and the communists did all the things that that teenager said. But we can get an idea this is what a lot of young people in China thought. And we can also see that this Chinese Communist Revolution is dividing families. Here we have a teenager arguing with his grandfather. And we see this in revolutions and civil wars across the world and across history. Families are often divided over these issues, and this war was just like those. So again, even with the limitations of this is just one person telling one story, we still can kind of get the idea that it is affecting families, individual families across China. All right, so let's get back to the story. Mao is now in complete control of the Communist Party. Remember, he was one of the founding members of the Communist Party. When the Communist Party started in China, it was like Mao and 3 other people. And now the Communist Party controls the entire country. Mao is looking to build the economy a lot like Stalin did in the Soviet Union with a series of 5-year plans. So notice here we have an economy that is going to be run by the state. And one of the most famous 5-year plans is known as the Great Leap Forward. And this is an important one that you definitely need to know. So the Great Leap Forward was essentially Mao and the government planning out the economy, setting quotas for industry, setting quotas for farms that you must produce X amount of goods every month. And usually these quotas were extremely high and extremely difficult to reach. And we start to see Mao also using mass propaganda. Here's a piece of a propaganda poster that was posted throughout China. And notice the quote here from Mao at the top. Struggle hard for 3 years, Mao says, because yes, this is going to be difficult. Everybody's going to be expected to work in either factory or farm. But then he says, change the face of China, catch up with Britain and America. Because remember, as far as industrialization goes, China's way behind England and the United States and those other major economic powers around the world. Because remember, if we think about kind of our history of the last 150 years, we know that industrialization begins in Europe, spreads to the United States, but outside of that, you don't see much industrialization around the world. And of course, in the late 1800s, China is having to deal with European imperialism, the Opium Wars, the Boxer Rebellion, etc. And of course, Japanese occupation during World War II. So Mao realizes that in order for China to become a world power, they're going to have to industrialize and do it quickly. So Notice even here in the cornucopia that these citizens are carrying. If everybody does their work for 3 years, there's gonna be lots of food and boats and airplanes. And actually, in the beginning, you do see increased economic output in China. The amount of food being produced in farms goes up. As you can see here with brand new tractors that were introduced, you see a lot more industrialization as well. But those gains were very short-lived. And after a while, things get unbearable for most workers in China. All those gains that the economy is making were coming because workers were, in some cases, being worked almost to death. In some factories, workers brought blankets because they were expected to work all day long until it's time to go to sleep. And they would sleep right there next to the machine. And when they woke up, they'd get right back to work. So workers were being expected to work like that. Farms were being collectivized. The type of farming that was being done was just not as efficient as past farming practices. So you see agricultural output decline as well, and led to mass famines across China. So things are starting to get really bad under the leadership of Mao. And Mao can start to feel his power slipping. Again, he was one of the founding members of the Communist Party in China. Communists in China loved him. But with the failures of the Great Leap Forward, people are looking to possibly replace Mao as leader of the Communist Party. And this is where we get into the Cultural Revolution, which is really a very dark time in Chinese history under Mao's rule. Mao starts preaching his new ideas and forcing them upon the population. So traditional Chinese ideas, and by traditional Chinese ideas, I of course mean Confucianism, which we know has been sort of the basis of Chinese governments going back to the Han Dynasty in 200 BCE, and now is being replaced by Maoist ideas on communism. And a lot of Mao's ideas were written in what's known as the Little Red Book. And you can see it here in this cartoon at the top. And even at this mass rally, you can see a couple of soldiers holding them as well. These red books were just a collection of Maoist writings about communism. A book or collection of writings in Chinese history. I wonder who else did that in Chinese history. Oh yeah, Confucius and the Analects. Y'all remember that, right? Everyone was expected to read the red books and carry it with them to show them support of Mao. And by the way, this Cultural Revolution lasts up until 1976 when Mao passes away. Another part of this Cultural Revolution, you see these huge rallies that took place all across China, filling up stadiums and public squares. Everyone was expected to attend. There were parades in honor of Mao and honor of the Communist Party. Sometimes in these parades or in these big gatherings, there would be something called a struggle session, where people that were deemed enemies of the Communist Party were brought forward, and everyone in the crowd would yell at them, taunt them, sometimes throw things at them. When things got really bad, sometimes they were put into the crowd and they were beaten up and sometimes killed. Struggle sessions happened at large gatherings like you see here in the stadium. They sometimes would happen in smaller gatherings, like the members of workers of a factory together that would have a smaller struggle session. You saw people accused of not being loyal enough to Mao and to the Communist Party arrested and jailed. You saw students who would speak out against their teachers or professors, and those teachers and professors were arrested for not teaching the correct values of Mao and the Communist Party. It's hard to say exactly how many people were jailed or executed during the Cultural Revolution, because in a lot of cases, numbers weren't really kept. But most historians would agree is at least somewhere in the low millions of people. So again, kind of think about how communism spreads, but also think about the main effects of that spread as well, like we see here in China. Okay, so we've talked about the Chinese Revolution. Yesterday, Mr. Smith talked about communism in Vietnam and Cuba and Korea. But there's also some other ways that you see it spread to other parts of the world. Let's especially go back to Latin America. Okay, in Latin America, so we're talking about kind of South America and Central America, We know that most of those countries gained their independence in the early 1800s. Everybody remembers Simón Bolivar, right? Hopefully you do. So these countries had been independent for a while now. But remember, even when a country gains independence, okay, obviously that's a good thing. You no longer have a colonial ruler. But that doesn't mean that all your problems go away. And especially in Latin America, you see economic inequality and class conflict continuing on into the 1900s. A lot of, you got to kind of consider when you think about the wealth gap between the rich and the poor. There's always going to be an economic gap between the rich and the poor. I mean, by definition, wealthy people have a lot of money and poor people don't. There's always going to be a gap. But when that gap gets too big, it is going to lead to economic and political instability, and it's going to be a problem for everyone. So let's talk about the example of Chile for a second. As these economic problems continued, you actually see the election of Salvador Allende to become the president of Chile in the early 1970s. Now, a lot of people accused Allende of being communist. Was he communist? It's hard to say, but definitely socialist, and definitely had some, communist ideas and communist leanings. But he was elected by the people of Chile to lead the country. All right. Now, we talked about containment the other day. We talked about the United States was not going to allow communism to spread, especially to countries in the Western Hemisphere. Mr. Smith talked yesterday about what happened when it came to Cuba. So what we see in Chile is the CIA for the United States government actually supporting a military coup led by a Chilean general named Augusto Pinochet. So remember earlier we were doing that warm up, and I said the United States had no problem pressuring countries to end communism, but a lot of times they did it much more covertly than the Soviet Union. At the time, nobody realized the CIA was doing this. People had some ideas, but it never became public. But the point is, when Pinochet becomes president, this leads to mass violence across the country and leads to some serious oppression of any type of dissenters. So we're talking about dissenters being communists, socialists. There were some in the Catholic Church, basically anybody that disagreed with what Pinochet was doing. And you see executions, you see show trials, kind of similar to what we saw in the Cultural Revolution in China. But in in Chile especially, you see the disappearance of thousands of citizens. And when I say disappearance, I mean, we know that they were probably killed, but never without any trial, without any evidence to show any guilt of any crime. They just simply disappeared. So again, I want you to understand how communism came to many countries around the world, whether it be through revolutions, whether it be through elections, whether it be through proxy wars between the United States and Soviets, but also you need to understand the effects of that as well. All right, so in our debrief, what we've learned today, what I just said, we talked about how communism took root in China specifically, and you do need to know about China specifically, but also you should be able to give some other examples of other countries. And like I said, we talked about the limitations of a document. It's not enough in an essay just to say, this document's biased, throw it out. Let's talk about limitations, but also again, even with those limitations, we can still always gather something from those documents. All right, it's time for a little exam practice. Now, y'all know that really mean teacher that gives you homework on a Friday afternoon to do over the weekend? Yeah, that's kind of gonna be me right now. But y'all know, like I said, this is practice for you to get ready. I can't require you to do it, but talk to your teacher if you want to go over it. And like I said, Mr. Smith will go over this with y'all next week. So we set up a Google Drive folder, and the link to it's right below me in the information section here. It's just simply called 8.4 homework, because today we're studying topic 8.4 from the CED. It's going to be a short answer question. There's a quote from Salvador Allende, and then there's 3 questions to go with it. So take a look at it, work on it a little bit over this weekend. If you want to talk to your teacher, get some personalized feedback, I think that'd be a great idea. Otherwise, Mr. Smith will go over that with y'all next week. Okay, one more thing before you go though, real quickly. Y'all know that the AP test this year is going to be done online. You're going to have the opportunity to do it from home. The College Board next week is going to release a whole lot of information about exactly what that looks like. To be honest, I don't even know right now. Okay, this is a brand new thing for all of us. But the College Board does understand that technology and access to technology can be an issue. So they're looking to gather some information and looking to help students that need technology in their home. So if you could, there's a website right down here with a survey about technology use. If you feel like access to technology is going to be a barrier for you or is going to be a problem for you, please go fill it out. Or if you know someone else you think is going to have that problem, talk to them and help them figure this out. Because the College Board definitely wants to help you to make sure you have the access to technology that you need. Also, if access to technology is going to be an issue, talk to your teacher, talk to your principal at your school or someone in your district, because I know that a lot of districts across the country are working on the same issue. All right, thank you so much. I appreciate you spending time with me on a late Friday afternoon. Y'all have a good weekend. Stay safe. Again, contact your teachers. They can help you out. Y'all have a good weekend. We'll talk next week. Bye.